All right. Can you all see the screen well?
Affirmative.
Great, thank you. So you all are muted, and we're working on the honor system. So if you have a question, you can ask it by unmuting yourself, but please wait till the end of the talk to ask the questions. So our speaker tonight is Brian K. Sullivan. The title of his presentation is Long-Term Studies of Herpetofauna on the Metropolitan Edge, Conservation Insights for the Sonoran Desert. Dr. Sullivan first searched for amphibians and reptiles in Arizona in 1970. He returned every year thereafter and arrived for good in 1979. He was hired as an assistant professor of zoology at ASU in 1989, promoted to full professor of herpetology in 2002, and served as the editor of the Journal of Herpetology from 2000 through 2005. With students, colleagues, and his family, he has examined the behavioral ecology and conservation biology of amphibians and reptiles of the Southwest for over 50 years. Sullivan has authored roughly 200 articles, book reviews, technical reports, and book chapters, including many co-authored with students and colleagues in the Phoenix area. Tonight, he will speak on his ongoing studies of urban impacts on the Sonoran Desert Herpetofauna. He'll argue that a thorough understanding of how particular species have responded to anthropogenic change requires detailed, long-term study of their respective natural histories. A snake community, 5 lizard species, and the Sonoran Desert Tortoise will be used to exemplify these perspectives. So I'm going to stop sharing and make Ryan, let's see here. Co-host. All right. Are you there, Brian?
I am. So it looks like I can share. Are we ready to go?
Yeah, you can share now.
Very good.
Looks good.
All right, there we go. Thanks for that introduction, Robert. It's great to be able to speak with all of you folks in the THS, both here in Arizona and a handful of you from elsewhere in the country. And tonight, I know most of you are here to just see my slides and hear my tidbits of natural history on the herps of the Phoenix metro area, on the edge of it and the adjacent Sonoran Desert. But I do have a message which is not a particularly profound one, and it's certainly one that I know all of you are sensitive to and already well aware of, but I think it bears repeating. And that is, I'd say, what I've learned in my 30 to 40 years now of working on this particular study site and group of organisms, which started with the amphibians, including the Sonoran Desert toad in the early 1980s, was when I first went to the sites you're going to hear about tonight. It is that deeper understanding of the natural history of individual species is absolutely vital to our current conservation crisis and the interest we all have in conservation biology of herps, as well as all other organisms and ourselves for that matter. And that unfortunately, the academy, or academia in terms of its training of current and future biologists, has continued to turn away from that area of biology. And don't get me wrong, we all know there are lots of us who are doing natural history and getting along with it just fine in the world today. But I think that in spite of the last 50 years post the environmental movement that I grew up with in the 60s and 70s, that we need even more of this, because the things we have to do with the conservation of biotic diversity really are contingent on our understanding of the ecology, the natural history of the individual species. So tonight I'm going to talk about 5 lizards and the lessons they've taught me in this regard, the Sonoran Desert Tortoise, and a snake community. As usual, lots of people to acknowledge, and this is just a smattering of them, a number of colleagues, a number of undergraduate students, graduate students. All of my family has participated at one time or another, and some members that are present here tonight, those shown here in the center, for example, there's the elusive Roger Rep that we spoke of earlier, and Randy Babb are ones that have shared a great deal of knowledge with me about the natural history of herps, and as well as a number of photos. I always have to especially thank Randy for many of the photos that I have pirated from his collection that you might see tonight. So the 5 lizards to begin with: Sauromalus ater, the Chuckwalla, Dipsosaurus dorsalis on the lower right there, the desert iguana, are 2 of the 5. They persist in the Phoenix area, either in preserves that we'll learn about or in the urban area per se. And then these additional 3, that's Phrynosoma solare, the regal horned lizard in the upper left, Urosaurus ornatus, the ubiquitous tree lizard, everybody's backyard with a block wall has them here in Phoenix, and then Uta stansburiana, the side-blotched lizard, common ground-dwelling form. Now I start off with this geologic map of central Arizona, and if you're not able to see all of that print, it doesn't really matter except to grasp that it's central Arizona, and that is, it's the Phoenix metro area with colors coding geologic formations and soil types. The, of course, fact that it's so populated by a variety of colors is a testament to the great geologic diversity of our state that you're all familiar with. That's not what I'm getting at. What I want you to recognize is that much of it is 2 shades of yellow, which is, in my very unscientific, interpretation of geology, means it's flats, it's floodplains and valley bottomlands of degraded geologic formations from the mountains. And that what I want you to understand is that the vast majority of the Phoenix metro area, shown in more or less this red circle, was historically creosote burr sage flat. We know that. We have plant samples. There were some salt bush flats near the Salt River, the Gila, but primarily it was that habitat. And we all know what that looks like. Primarily creosotes, burr sage, don't happen to be many in this shot, an occasional cactus and some palo verdes, but very homogeneous habitat. And these are just some rough figures that I've gotten from historical biogeographers over the year. But what I want to speak about first is the Phoenix Mountain Preserve System, which was initiated in the 1960s. It's amazing that our forefathers, as they were at the time in the Phoenix area in the 50s and 60s, set their sights on the preservation of a series of mountain areas that had yet to be developed, of course, back in the 60s. And this was the establishment of something that came to be a great opportunity for us biologists who came upon the scene over the next 5 decades. What I want to point out here, as we'll see shortly, is that it was of only one habitat type. Rather than those yellow geologically indicative flats we just saw sight of in that previous slide, they were exclusively patches of upland slope habitat. So now let's take a look at our 5 lizard species with that little bit of history of what Phoenix has looked like over the last 100 years of development and what it looked like historically. So Chuckwalla, I'm sure I don't have to tell the vast majority of you, is a rock dwelling specialist. So it was known to be found throughout the valley wherever there's appropriate habitat. Regal horned lizard was valley wide, but in flats. Desert iguana, there weren't a lot of collections, but based on what we knew about that lizard from areas to the west and to the south, it was presumed to be throughout the valley in flats. tree lizard, primarily thought to be in the Phoenix area in riparian corridors, living in trees, of course. And the only preserves where it was thought to occur in any numbers were those with a large component of vertical habitat. By that, I mean massive rock faces, such as you can find in Piestewa Peak or South Mountain. Side-blotched lizard thought to be ubiquitous throughout the valley, flats, slopes, washes. But you get the idea. These lizards have different niches. We all know that they have different habitats. You pick up your Stebbins and scroll through and go out in the field, and this hits you over the head. So you might be thinking, I'm not really telling you something that you didn't already know, and I'd agree with you. But let's take a look at how the Chuckwallas have fared over this time period since the mountain preserves. How have they fared with the great expansion of the Phoenix Metropolitan blob, as we all affectionately refer to it? So these are the color morphs that are possible in the Phoenix area. I should say two of the three. But in any case, they are in the top two instances in relatively unusual habitats. The one in the upper left is in a river rock foundation of a dam, well away from any natural rock habitat, but it has colonized it along with a number of other Chuckwallas over the years. And so it's a very unnatural habitat. There are no crevices. It's clambering around on river rock. I'm sure you're all familiar with that in landscaping, and they have to crawl under the rock. They can't get into a crevice like that one at the bottom, which is one from South Mountain, in a crevice where it should be. That's part of their affinity for rocks and crevices, their anti-predatory tactic you're no doubt all familiar with. And then there's one that's actually living on somebody's block wall adjacent to a preserve. Now, what I was able to do by coupling some work that some of my students were doing on behavioral projects was to look at Chuckwalla populations in every mountain preserve that we could sample, which was in the end all of them in the Phoenix areas, and including some that aren't officially Phoenix mountain preserves. And we did that in the early 90s, mid 90s, and then we did it again roughly 15 to 20 years later. What we found was that all of those preserves, small, large, in between, as long as they had rocks, had Chuckwallas. And we didn't have to actually capture them, mark them, and then return. We developed a means by which we could survey for them indirectly by counting their fecal pellets, which are quite distinct. They're the only herbivorous animal in the mountain preserves that produces a classic reptilian uric acid attached pellet made of plant material that's asymmetric. Trust me, we could train students to do this in 5 minutes, and they never failed to only get Chuckwalla droppings. And so we were quite proud of ourselves for figuring that this was a good way to sort them out, having to only test that there was a strong correlation between fecal counts and the density of Chuckwallas at a couple of sites that we did with mark recapture methods. In any case, what we found is over this 15 to 20 year period, there was an amazingly strong correlation between numbers at these sites, meaning we surveyed them, then we surveyed them again 15 to 20 years later, and it appears that Chuckwalla populations are just fine. They're stable. They do not seem to have been significantly impacted, even though many of these preserves saw a great increase in trail use, number of pets that visited, and all sorts of other activities associated with human use. And in fact, at one site that was particularly well studied, where we had marked them for those density estimates, we recaptured 40% of the animals 15 years later, which was, and here we'll just go on a little tangent because it's such an interesting aspect. No one really knew. We thought that Chuckwallas might be relatively long-lived animals, but I just want to point out a couple of the females who were captured as adults. So at roughly 150 millimeters, they're a young adult. They've been sexually mature since about 125 millimeters. So this particular female was captured in 1995. That little yellow circle on that aerial photo of this preserve, and you can see some houses off there to the left, gives you a sense of scale. She was captured 16 years later within about 12 meters of her original capture site. And she'd grown roughly a millimeter a year over that time span. So just astounding philopatry. Females have very small home ranges. Males have much larger ones, but that was one female. This was a female who was a relatively large female when first captured. And you might be able to tell from her, her countenance there. She's lost most of the protective scale coverings that would cover her ear. The tympanum has 3 large scales over it normally, but sliding in and out of crevices for perhaps 25, 30 years. We don't know for a fact, but my guess is this old female was, when we did this photo, was probably pushing 30 years. She's grown less than 1 millimeter a year, and that might have been what her growth rate was through the 140 and 150 millimeter, periods of growth for her. But that's just a guess. We minimally know she was an adult, and she was around 16 years later, which is quite impressive. So on the conservation front, it appears that we've done well by our Chuckwalla friends in the sense of the mountain preserves. They are allowing the populations to persist. They probably make up, those preserves, most of the habitat. Very few of the mountain portions of the Phoenix metro area are just filled in with houses these days. It's only been the rich and famous who can afford that kind of construction activity. But in any case, they have appeared to do well. The one concern would be, which I'm sure is occurring to many of you, is that gene flow has been stopped. There are, of course, no real prospects for exchange among these mountain preserves. And if you thought that, well, Chuckwallas probably don't do that, they do. Naturally, Chuckwallas are found crossing flats, and the juveniles often move out at great distances to colonize places. Those river rock islands that I mentioned are colonized very quickly. So that's a long-term concern. But in the short term, Chuckwallas have probably been served well. So let's look at another species, the regal horned lizard. So it's a central Sonoran Desert species, creosote flats throughout the valley. A very special thing about it is that it has one ant species, at least in this part of Arizona, to which it is wedded as its prey species. In fact, I think it was just a few years ago, we published a paper, my students and I, in the Sonoran Herpetologist, in which we documented that exclusive use of this ant is common among the females of the species here, the regal horned lizard, that we've been studying at one preserve. And they eat about 200 of them a day. It's just astounding. Here's one of those lizards at the rough seed harvester. Those of you that have ever experienced the bite and simultaneous sting of one of these, don't forget it. You know just which ant I'm speaking of, but it's the large seed harvester that has a large disc nest opening up to about 1 meter across that's quite easily recognized. And that's the ant that our horned lizard feeds on. There's one of the fecal pellets, just an aside, just as we found with the Chuckwallas, you can survey for these lizards, which are often difficult to see. They're very cryptic. Those of you that have looked for them can know how this can be exceptionally difficult to find them. That's one of their fecal pellets. And when you break it apart, it's made up of exclusively this ant species, at least in our neck of the woods in this particular part of Arizona. Now, here are the mountain preserves that were a part of the study, both for the Chuckwallas and then for this horned lizard species. And this is just a different aerial view of the Phoenix blob. And those red outlines are various mountain preserves. Those of you familiar with the Phoenix area, that's the biggest one at the bottom is South Mountain. One that I'll talk quite a bit about up at the top is not a mountain preserve. It's a county flood control site, Cave Buttes. So you'll see it has some mountains in it, the Union Hills, in fact, but also it's the only one with a large area of flats. And these blobs, the cartoon images that were superimposed here, were done by a student of mine, and I won't try to explain the algorithm that went into these. They were meant to be simply an extraction, a projection of a series of variables. But for today's talk, we'll say that they were more or less a summation of the presence or absence of the regal horned lizard, the amount of soil that predicted the ants that we think are the critical prey species, and then the number of fecal pellets. So again, it was a complex series of relationships. But what I really want you to get from this image, red is the presence of horned lizards, and the bigger the red blob, the more horned lizards. So you can see, for example, that Cave Buttes, that one at the top, is a hotbed of horned lizard activity for this particular species. And that the interior, black means no horned lizards. And then there's some degree of habitat availability, and often none of the ants present. And there's only a single one in the interior. It was the largest preserve. It's Piestewa Peak, if you know the Phoenix area. That shows red to black because historically it had horned lizards. We used to take our ecology lab classes to this preserve in the late 80s and all through the 90s, and we would see horned lizards. If we didn't see horned lizards, we would see their pellets and the students would count them. By 2000, they were extirpated. And what we believe happened was the ants were extirpated and the horned lizards followed. We don't have an explanation for that. We've talked to ant specialists about whether climate change might be involved. What was it that might have caused those ant populations to decline? But that's the interior site that had them has now lost them. And no other interior site had them, even though historically, if those interior sites had any flats, they probably did have horned lizards. Now, again, recall what we saw earlier with Chuckwallas. Those preserves are largely slope habitat. They often are missing ants simply because there are no flats. And so by definition, they don't have horned lizards. So in extrapolating to the valley at large, we are confident that horned lizards are absent from the vast majority of the valley. The interior preserves that are just slopes don't have them. And then the one that did have about a square kilometer of flats habitat with ants apparently lost those ants and the horned lizards. But some of those outlying preserves, I won't go back to the previous slide, but the smaller orange red dots were some very small preserves that had a lot of horned lizards because they're on the periphery and they still retain ants. They have large numbers of ants. So it wasn't, we think, the size of the preserve being too small or the degree of disturbance from hikers or cats and dogs and so on. We think the driver here is this single factor, the prey species. And as long as it persists, the horned lizards appear to be able to hang on. So our third lizard, the desert iguana shown here, is another flatland dwelling species. And this is one that will make me look bad, but it's worth hearing how it unfolded. So Cave Buttes is originally on the outskirts of Phoenix, and it's not until the 1990s that the powers that be, which is the Phoenix Parks Department and Maricopa County Flood Control District, start talking about the fact that they should set aside part of it, as much of it as possible, as a preserve on the outlying area, given all of the recreational use of the interior preserves and so on. And so it was forward-thinking planning. And they knew that I worked there. I'd had permission for years from the flood control district. So at one point they called me in to ask, what did I recommend should be done with the Cave Buttes area? And my whole pitch to them was, don't just preserve the Union Hills, which are to the left of the little question mark I inserted. I said, preserve as much of the flats and the washes as you can. You need to get habitat heterogeneity into that. And I used one example. I said, if you do that, if you preserve this part of the Cave Butte site, those are the Union Hills in the background, you preserve these flats, you'll do a number of things for this system in the sense of increasing the diversity, plants, animals. And of course, I had to give them an example. And I said, desert iguanas. I'm confident you will get an additional lizard species that's absent from the interior preserves, the desert iguana. Now, at that time, I'd been working exclusively on the amphibians at Cave Buttes. I would go out during the day and I was confident desert iguanas were there, but I hadn't seen any yet. And what ended up happening was, after they took my word for it, and they have continued through over the next 3 decades, there are parts of those flats that have been preserved. They don't have desert iguanas. They aren't there. And I look at that, and I still at the time am thinking it's a creosote flat. And it's about 10 years ago now that we figured this out, when I start into these other studies of the lizards in the flats, instead of just working on the amphibians. And if you just keep a image vaguely of that skyline of the Union Hills. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, gosh. That's just terrible. I realized a slide that I thought I had inserted here probably was left on the home version of the thing. I'm in my office. I'll have to go back here and just give it to you. If I backed up a bit from here, or later during the discussion section, I can load it on. You would see that the creosote flat wasn't as good of a creosote flat as I'm letting on. Just 200 or 300 meters behind me, it's got a bunch of what you would have taken for invasive grasses. And, you know, we often see that after wet winters, that a creosote flat will look very much different. But when I looked at them close enough one day, I realized those aren't invasive grasses, they're tobosa, which is, you know, a real indicator of a very different kind of habitat historically. Then I discovered there are cane choyas, which are a classic grassland choya species. As I'm poking around here, I get a botanist to come out with me, and then I talked to Dave Brown and Randy Babb, and I'll cut to the chase since you can't see my little slide of tobosa grasses. They are convinced, Dave especially, that just 3,000 years ago, this north end of the Phoenix area looked about like the Agua Fria grasslands, about 30, 40 miles due north of us, at about 3,000 feet. We're only at 2,000 feet here. And that grassland has degraded with the climate change that's been going on for thousands of years here. And what I can add to that is, not only were there these tobosa grasses, but the soil here in those soil maps ends up being a much greater clay constitution than sand. And you'll see where I'm going to go with this now. So another student ended up looking for desert iguanas in the last 10 years. So these are only recent records from one study done in 1 year, but they exemplify the hypothesis that we have in mind now for desert iguanas. That black dot in the upper center is the Cave Butte site. All of the other sightings that he was able to amass here are along riparian corridors, not necessarily a flowing river. You know, many of them, like the Hassayampa or the Agua Fria or the New River, are largely just dry, sandy floodplains. But Dipsosaurus is found all along these in the Phoenix area. And on the north edge of Phoenix, in those clay soils, what were former grasslands, I think it's just where it drops out naturally, a biogeographic edge effect of where we are in the Phoenix metro area. At first we thought, oh, they're not there because of something to do with degradation of the habitat or disturbance or something we're doing. Cave Buttes, in spite of those pictures, is a very disturbed habitat. Mining, grazing, recreational vehicle use, not to mention the flood control activities. And this map shows us those, you know, aspects of the range of Dipsosaurus. I won't dwell on this now, but you know, that's the edge there in the central Arizona area. Because here is what that student discovered. Driving around Phoenix, I'll never forget the day he calls me and says, Dr. Sullivan, I'm taking a lunch break, but I'm taking data. I'm in the line at McDonald's. There are 2 desert iguanas displaying right here on the edge. You know, there isn't a creosote bush for a mile. And this is in the West Valley of Phoenix. And I had always thought desert iguanas were quite tolerant of disturbance, growing up with them in California in areas like Palm Springs and such. There's one living in a vacant lot. You know, and there are a couple of them there. These are, this time, black dots mean presence, but in the West Valley, that's the Agua Fria River floodplain on the left and the New River on the right. And if you looked closely enough here, you could see there's lots of housing development and such in this view. And there are desert iguanas everywhere. It's simply that they're sandy soils, and they're to the southwest of the northern edge with those clay soils at Cave Buttes. So if we had preserved a little mountain range out in the West Valley with adjacent flats habitat of this nature, we'd have all the desert iguanas, we'd know what to do with. Now, again, this isn't rocket science to get to this point to say chuckwallas need rocks and desert iguanas need sandy soil and horned lizards need their prey. I'm with you 100%. It isn't rocket science. But the point is that the community of lizards in an area, and you might say, well, Phoenix is a big area, but it's not all that big. We're just talking about, 30, 40, 50 miles diagonally from one angle corner to the other. We can see these, shifts in what it means to be a flatland dwelling lizard and who are the other lizards that are with you. And this is something that, these three lizards, were teaching me as I was continuing these studies. And that notions of the presence or absence in a preserve being solely attributable to what we had done, disturbance, let's say, recently, wasn't always the way we should be going. There were some of these, historical contingency aspects that were critical to understanding the distribution and abundance of species. And that's going to continue with these two, which are, of course, I'm sure everyone's aware of, dirt common species, tree lizards and side-blotched lizards. As their name implies, or at least the side-blotched lizard used to be called the ground Uta. It's a ground dwelling form and very similar sized lizard, both phrynosomatids. The tree lizard is a tree dwelling or vertical habitat specialist. Now, I was interested in the dynamic of these two species because my impression was the tree lizard is found everywhere in Phoenix now. It's what we would call an urban exploiter. And that's because I think we put in block walls, which are as good as a tree as far as it's concerned. And on the other hand, side-blotched lizards are absent from the vast majority of the valley, except in the preserves. The minute you step into a mountain preserve, doesn't matter if it's small, large, has ants, has rocks, doesn't, side-blotched lizards are present. So we took an approach for a one-year survey of considering the Cave Buttes flats as a proxy for what the Phoenix metro flats might have looked like. Now, I know we already discovered that, well, desert iguanas weren't there, so it's not a perfect proxy, but just bear with me on assuming it might be for these two species. So in that year, we recorded all of the lizards via visual encounter surveys and coverboard surveys and so on. And we find that the side-blotched lizard is by far and away the most abundant lizard in our Cave Butte site, whether you're on slopes, flats, or in washes. Over 3,000 individual side-blotched lizards observed, not a single tree lizard. Didn't matter if you were looking at a tree, a rock face, there aren't any big trees there. It has no riparian corridor with cottonwoods and willows, but not a single tree lizard. Then a number of other students did paired surveys to confirm this relationship between our tree lizards found throughout the valley and our side-blotched lizards missing from those sites that harbor tree lizards. And they did very simple, elegant experiments for a semester. They recorded all of the lizards that they saw in their neighborhood, along block walls, on sidewalks, on ornamental trees, whatever it was. And then they had to drive or hoof it to the nearest mountain preserve and hike into it and spend a similar amount of time. And at the end of that study, I'm not giving you the numbers here because it was so obvious. They found only tree lizards in the neighborhoods and only side-blotched lizards in the mountain preserves. It was as clear a pattern as you could get. So what I've concluded is that we all knew side-blotched lizards were found throughout the valley, and they're largely absent. They have not been able to tolerate development. And it's most likely for reasons you can all think of. We'll see one example here in a moment. But the tree lizards have been just the opposite. They were likely absent, like they're absent from cave buttes today, for the majority of the valley, except the riparian-lined corridors and the preserves with really large geologic formations with a lot of vertical habitat. Those of you, again, who might be familiar with Piestewa Peak, you can hike around Piestewa Peak and not see tree lizards until you get to the monolith, until you get to the primary metavolcanic formations that are quite sheer, that you bust your hump going up to the top of the peak and such, and turn around and come back. That's where you see the tree lizards. It's the interior portion alone. In any case, they have expanded greatly in their range, is my argument. And the side-blotched lizards, I think, don't fare as well in these urban environments because of predation by cats. There are others that take them as well. I'm doing a little study right now on a pair of kestrels that are breeding in my backyard. It's amazing how many tree lizards these things take. And we know they take side-blotched lizards. Randy Babb has documented that out in the desert habitat. And so those little raptors are, I think, also benefiting in urban settings. So in any case, a whole host of predators probably take a toll on side-blotched lizards besides all of our activities and have contributed to their decline. So where are we with the lizards at this point? We can say that the preserves have a low diversity of lizards, and I'm not giving you those numbers tonight just to save time, but the number of species found there, for the simple reason that they don't contain enough habitat heterogeneity. And that if they do follow my advice, in spite of it not having proven true for desert iguanas at cave buttes, they'll provide for a greater range of herpetofauna in future preserves by including more of those habitats. It's also important to recognize that, yeah, if you were deciding that desert iguanas were worth preservation, that you wouldn't put your preserves on the north end of town. You would need to be putting them on the south and the west, and to include those habitats. And that out of these, it's really only the tree lizards that are urban exploiters. There's one other common urban species, the tiger whiptail, which I won't be talking about tonight, but that is the other commonly observed lizard in yard environments. But I want to shift gears now to desert tortoises and talk about how they are doing in the Phoenix metro area. And we'll address this question: can they persist in interior preserves? And I'm guessing those of you that know anything about natural history of tortoises are already imagining where we're going to go with this. But let's start with yet another aerial view of central Arizona. And the central Phoenix area there you can focus on as being the smallest red circle with the question mark in it. That's surrounding Piestewa Peak. The outline ones are the White Tank Mountains on the left there, South Mountain at the bottom, and then the McDowell Mountains on the right. And there's good old Cave Buttes at the north. Those are all what I'm referring to as peripheral large preserves. And they all have vibrant, as near as we can tell, populations of Sonoran Desert Tortoises. Piestewa Peak has just a handful, literally a handful of adults hanging on, no juveniles, but there are a few tortoises that are still there. And my guess is they're on their way out, but they're very small numbers. So that's why I put a question mark there. And I want to start out with one of my, I think, just impressive anecdotes about tortoises. And of course, we just heard that Sauromalis might be a long-lived lizard. You all know that tortoises are at least thought to be very long-lived. In the Sonoran Desert, and especially the Mojave Desert, it's probably the case that they don't live generally more than about 35 or 40 years. And that just is built on the fact that it's a tough place to make a living. And in any case, what they do in captivity is a far cry from what they do in the real world. But I want you to just keep your eye on the date. You'll have to take my word for it. The scene changes because of changing conditions each winter. But this is an interesting little sequence. That's the first day that we found this female out, female 22 as she comes to be numbered, basking on her caliche. That's a caliche formation. The refuge is behind her in the winter. And she got tagged, of course, because we found her. So she's got a radio tag on her now. And if you keep track of the dates here, the little brittle bush in the upper right corner there changes depending on whether it's a wet winter or dry winter. Here she is the next year. You get where this is going. Here she's coming out. For one thing, she's consistently out in the winter. And by the way, the male that she is followed by year round is in the preserve, in the refuge behind her. The males don't typically come out and bask or feed in the winter. The females do. But in any case, it's the same male number 18 is in there every year. And there we are. Brittle bush is bigger that year. Big that year. These are all her. That's a dry year. Brittle bush isn't as leafed out that year, but there she is. That's a different camera, so it looks different, but that's her, and it's a wet year. This year's been a relatively dry year, and there she is. So this will be obvious to you shortly as to why I impressed this fidelity on you. But let's talk about them in these preserves. They require washes where these caliche formations are, at least our populations. The granitic formations you might be aware of tortoises using in places like Sugarloaf aren't present here. So they rely almost exclusively on caliche refuges in the banks of washes. And those, as we've already seen, washes are typically not part of the mountain preserve system. Piestewa Peak was the one exception that has a few, less than a kilometer of a wash. The other thing about tortoises is their behavior, much worse than the Chuckwallas basking on block walls. They think, if you ask me, and it's always dangerous to anthropomorphize like this, but judging their use of them, they think that paths and roadways have been put into the desert for their benefit. When they have to truck it over a slope of a few hundred meters to get to a little water catchment, as I've seen them do, and we put in a dirt road for them, they use the road every time. They don't go off-roading, clambering over the rocks. And those of you that might have followed tortoises around know that when they're on these steep slopes, which is their preferred habitat, they're not out in the flats, they are really having to work. And they take advantage of these unnatural opportunities. So this is a top of a dike at Cave Buttes, and that's 450 meters across. This female used it regularly to go from behind me, where I'm taking this picture from, to that opposite slope when she was foraging in the spring and fall. And she thought that's what it was there for, is all I can conclude. Others in areas where the preserve is adjacent to suburban dwellings, they pay no attention whatsoever to those structures. They make use of them. This is one of the females basking in the morning in an area of relatively low density housing. And trust me, the folks living there don't have any problem with the tortoises, but you get the idea. The roadways associated with them, the pets associated with them, these are recipes for a number of difficulties. Just to give you an example, this female regularly made use of these conduits, these drainage pipes, in order to navigate her wash. It didn't appear to bother her at all to have to, use the metal tubes to go through there. That she's in the wash in those red circles there, but she's going back and forth between this area of housing and the natural habitat. This is part of Cave Buttes where the flood control activities occur. Housing there in the lower left, this is her home range, and she's out there in the houses for part of the year, up there on the north slope, foraging with the other tortoises that live in the preserve for the rest of the year. And that's the next year. So she's consistently doing this. And this tortoise is one of our only fatalities. We don't know why, she wasn't killed by an organism, and she was smaller than the other tortoises. You could speculate, and I won't bother to, as to whether she ingested something, but in any case, she was one of our fatalities. We've had a couple of natural fatalities as well, so don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that the only one that was in urban areas is the one that perished. But to sum up for the tortoises, they require these large washes with caliche formations. All of ours, at least, spend some time in the fall on north-facing slopes. So some preserves aren't adequately, positioned for as good of a habitat adjacent to a wash. This is dependent on perhaps the idiosyncratic nature of our populations, but it's something that we've witnessed. They use the trails, roads, tracks, I talked about this, and they expose themselves to risk of harm. Two of ours that were closest to the human habitations were collected. Now, that's a best guess as to what happened to them after they were tagged. But we talked to people who said, oh, they thought they needed to be rescued. They wondered what, and this was something, I hadn't experienced before, what the scientists were doing to them by putting radio tags on them, and was this really in their best interest, and so on. And so piecing it together from some of the people that we've met there over the years, we're convinced, and Game and Fish agreed with us, that it was likely we lost two to collectors who might have been collecting them for their own good in at least their minds, if you follow that tortured logic on my part. In any case, and the bottom line is we know they have been lost and are no doubt slated to be extirpated at the one remaining preserve. So this was what led me to my obsession with translocation, or more appropriately these days, mitigation translocation, as a practice in conservation biology. So we've decided that Sonoran Desert Tortoise populations on the edge with human habitations, if the preserve is not large enough, are probably in a bad way. And one commonly used solution to mitigate human-animal conflict is translocation. Pick them up, move them out to another area, and allow them to live happily ever after, if that's what happens. We initiated a very small-scale program with only 5 animals, and in the interest of time, I've left some slides out that are at the end of the talk if people end up having questions about those details. But I'm just going to, summarize some of them for you here now. Now, I'll say again, this built on some work I'd done, not just with tortoises, but with Gila monsters, in which I came to conclude that organisms with a strong landscape awareness, and what I mean by that is consistent use of refuges, consistent social dynamics between males and females, that those organisms as adults are not good candidates for mitigation translocation, because you're wrenching them out of the landscape that they are intimately connected to and placing them in a new landscape that's already populated by members of their species. You wouldn't be doing it otherwise. That's the goal with mitigation translocation. So you're not really gaining anything. You're just saving the individual, but possibly at a great cost to them as individuals. What I mean by that is all studies that we've reviewed in these 2 papers that I'm just showing the titles of here have found that not just with reptiles, but a variety of other mammals, birds, and so on, generally expend greater amounts of energy and time and suffer greater mortality in response to being translocated as an adult. For example, and again here I'm just summarizing these results for these 5, 2 out of the 5 had to be rescued more than once. And what I mean by that is we translocated the tortoises from those dam and dike environments, like where I showed you that picture of the female, because the flood control people were worried that they were going to run over them with their equipment during maintenance activities and so on. So we agreed to translocate those tortoises to the west into the Union Hills, where we had a study population. Of those 5, 2 of them moved so much that they eventually made their way back to the dam and dike areas, but weren't to the sites they were from and got trapped among dam structures, pits, and various things. And we had to rescue them, repatriate them to the new translocation site. You get the idea. If we hadn't been following them with radio tags, they would have perished. There's almost no doubt. Other aspects of their behavioral ecology are different from the residents. They use a greater array of refuges. They overwinter in multiple refuges, meaning in each year, rather than that female who was using the same one, they consistently pick a new one. Now, you could argue, well, after, and it's now been 5 years, they're all still alive. But again, the argument is, from my perspective, they have endured a number of consequences, and it was not happily ever after as we had naively imagined back in the day, which, if you're not aware, mitigation translocation is a classic approach, right? It's not just the bears in Jellystone Park that are, transported away and hopefully never come back, and then they always do, and they eventually get shot. But we've been doing it with rattlesnakes and Gila monsters on a massive scale here in Phoenix and Tucson. And we do just let those go and hope they live happily ever after. But the evidence is that they likely do not. And in any case, if you're going to use it, it should be, I think, always a well-calculated best of the bad situations, if you have no other alternatives, and then do it with an aim towards obtaining data as to the outcome. And that means radio tracking your subjects. Okay, now I'm going to close here with what we've done with snakes. And this won't be so much about conservation lessons as just some aspects of working with a snake community, again, on the north edge of town, and seeing some differences with other snake communities here in the Southwest, and some interesting methodological tidbits that have been uncovered. So this is a 10-year data set. We've got about 700 individual snakes seen. We've only got 15 species. We'll come back to that. That's a little low for a Sonoran Desert site. And we used a variety of sampling methods. We have a small, it's only 4 kilometers worth of paved road. It's off limits to the public, but in the flood control site at Cave Buttes, we have that available to us to road ride at night looking for snakes. And then we have an array of coverboards, which is just glorified refuse, literally. Pieces of plywood people had dumped out there in the desert because Cave Buttes wasn't kept off limits until the last 20 years or so. And really only the last 10 years has it been patrolled by sheriffs and park personnel to keep people out. But in any case, lots of trash, and we just repositioned the good trash, nice pieces of plywood, into a coverboard array, which I'm sure most of you have a vague notion of. And then visual encounter surveys, meaning while we're performing other jobs, we would break for visual counts of lizards and snakes. And then I should have added here, incidentally. So meaning anytime we were driving through the site from one area to another, from one part of it, doing a tortoise survey to a horned lizard survey, if we encountered a snake, we would record its presence. And we'll see a comparison to some of these other sites. You don't need to strain yourself trying to figure out, what are all these lines and what are they getting at. But there have been a number of snake community studies that used road riding or road riding plus trapping. And that's mostly South Central Arizona. But down there at the lower left is Phil Rosen and Chuck Lowe's study from Organ Pipe, published in the 90s. So that's SR 85. And then I published a paper with Tom Jones and Randy Babb that we spoke of earlier on the 2 roadways in black, SR 238 and SVP on the upper left. And then my son and Dan Levitt at Game and Fish and I put together work that they had done in Florence, that's State Route 79 there, to compare to our study site. You can see the tiny little blip of paved road there at Cave Buttes. That's all on the left-hand side. The right-hand side shows the density of development adjacent to these areas. And it makes it look like they're not as dramatically different as you might have thought. I was a little disappointed in that. It's a significantly different increase for cave buttes, the upper right one, given the scale. But you'd be more impressed with how impacted cave buttes is if you came up there with me and saw it. But in any case, we'll come back to what the comparisons of these communities are. Let me just talk to you about the herps that we encountered. There's one of our coverboard arrays. That's Hypsiglena, the night snake, being uncovered there. We found more than, I'd say up to about half of our species at one time or another under a coverboard. There's a pair of atrox on the left there. If you can make out, it's a male, the larger one, who's mate guarding a female, the behavior that's been described by the likes of Roger Repp and Gordon Schuett. And then the upper left there showing even a masticophis can be under a coverboard. That's not especially common. But these figured into the methodological tidbit I'll talk about shortly. Sonora, and there's 3 different color phases under one board. And note that it's a wet winter. You'll take my word for it there. And there's 3 individuals there. And in fact, there's another uncovering with 3 or 4 individuals in that one. That's a handful of them that I pulled out from one board and snapped a picture of. Now, again, the incidental encounters, anytime that we found one on our little patch of paved road, and that was just an especially cooperative Pituophis that allowed me to take its body temperature while it was still basking on the road, and an atrox there. And then we could actually road ride, and in the evenings for snakes without any other traffic. So all our snakes were always AOR, or as we road riding aficionados call it. And those of you that have picked up many a dead one could appreciate that it was nice. They were always alive. So here's the percentage breakdown. And what I want you to recognize is the amazing dominance by atrox. Atrox does not dominate the natural snake communities that I alluded to earlier, and we'll see some of those data shortly as I wrap things up here. But it does here at Cave Buttes. And my thought is that it might be best positioned to take advantage of the reduction in other predators, coyotes, kit foxes, bobcats, and so on, and the consequent increase in lagomorph, rodent plus rabbit populations. And those of you that know Erica Novak's work, we're convinced that the large atrox, and by that I just mean 3.5 feet, a meter in size, are taking rabbits as often as they can. But in any case, the other species here, that's something that's a bit skewed, or I should say off from other snake communities that we'll see those data shortly. But I especially want you to scroll down to Sonora. 20% of the snakes that we have found have been ground snakes. In road riding studies, I had never encountered more than 1 or 2 out of 400 or 500 snakes. They typically are not encountered. And none of ours were on road riding. They were all under the coverboards. Now, I'll come back to that, but here's one interesting aspect. I want you to recognize atrox really dominated initially. And I don't have the rainfall data. You'll have to trust me that the last 5 years have been especially dry monsoons. And I know some of you have experienced it down there, but for Phoenix, we've had a number of years, 18, 19, and 20, for example, that none of my amphibians have bred at Cave Buttes. It's been just terribly dry. And we're convinced that the atrox who dropped their offspring in August, that recruitment is off as a result of that. But these data are quite striking for, even though it's still the dominant snake, there's an apparent decline. But look at this for Sonora. In the early days, there are 2 explanations here, and one of them's trivial, but informative. In the early days, we had just rearranged all of the coverboards. And it took a number of years for them to be seasoned, as coverboard fans term it. And that is positioned, starting to degrade, not being as, detached from the soil and the environment, is settling in, if you will. But the more important aspect is we learned as we went. We, in the middle of this decade, noticed that in the winter, we could occasionally get a toad under a coverboard. We had been ignoring them from late November, the coverboards, until February, just assuming that snakes weren't active. What we discovered was Sonora was almost exclusively active from late November to late February, but only in the years when it rained in the winter. If you went out in the coverboard as you lifted it up, exposed a dry substrate, cracked, there were no Sonora. If you went out in those years where it was grassy and it was moist underneath, they were out. So we changed our approach, and voila, we start seeing Sonora everywhere under all those coverboards. So this is a methodological consequence of us learning about the natural history of these critters. And I got ahead of myself there, so I've more or less said all of this. We think the decline in atrox is real. We think their dominance of the community is real, nonetheless, that they're declining. But Sonora, we think, no, it's just one of those small secretive snakes that we didn't know as much about historically until we started sampling them appropriately. These are those data with the other sites, and Cave Buttes is in red. This is a diversity plot when you want to have a quick and dirty look at the diversity of different communities of critters, in this case snakes. And it shows that most of the other Sonoran Desert sites that I was speaking of have relatively similar diversity profiles shown here, but Cave Buttes is a lower diversity site. Something is going on. And if it isn't just that the community has been impacted, perhaps it's partly to do with that biogeographic edge aspect of being a community on the north edge of Phoenix at the edge of the Sonoran Desert that was historically this Tobosa grassland environment 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. For example, a number of species that make up some of this diversity in those other sites are things that are dirt common, like Crotalus cerastes, the sidewinder. And you would all probably agree with me, oh yeah, you expect to find sidewinders where there are desert iguanas. They are both sand-loving species. And we already found out the desert iguanas are not there, and the same thing applies. Now, sidewinders are not found in the majority of the Phoenix area historically, but they're found all along the west, just 40, 50 miles to the west of Cave Buttes, you find them. So this, is the summary here. I've pretty much, covered this at this point, so I'm not going to belabor it here because I don't like going over an hour. And these were from a couple of sources. The one thing I really learned, and especially that work with the Gila monsters, then the tortoises, and now the horned lizards, which I didn't get to talk to you about, is that I absolutely agree with Erica. Until you radio track your animal, you really don't know it. There are amazing aspects of its behavioral ecology that are revealed to you by that. And then this is what students from herpetology put in my evaluations once. Or a couple of students did it in a written form. And it was that they were, tongue in cheek about it, but they thought I was really getting a little bit, pedantic about this business, that the more we knew about the natural history, the less that those generalizations that they wanted to be true were holding up. So I got a kick out of that and have used it in this context. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. And I don't know if I can still do this or not, but it looks like I can control it. While you're doing that, I'm going to load up the other copy just in case someone asks questions, because I've just realized the few changes I made I had so much trouble getting in, as I told you, Robert, that I used the desk copy. So I'm going to get rid of this, and you go ahead and do your thing and start asking questions while I'm doing this.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was a really, really great talk. And I know I have lots of questions, but is there anyone?
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Brian, do you have any guess why? I guess it's Pietzwa that the ants and the horned lizards disappeared. Do you have any guess about the disappearance of the, I guess, Pogonomyrmex?
I really don't. I've tried to get our local ant specialist, Bob Johnson over at ASU, to speculate on it. And they are very sensitive to temperature and to moisture. And so it seems easy to suggest that urban heat island effects might be more dramatic here, and that could be part of the explanation. But we don't have good temperature data profiles for what it was in the 90s versus the last 2 decades. But, you know, I just...
Do you or this ant expert see a lot of Pogonomyrmex yet around the Phoenix area?
Absolutely. Absolutely, we do.
Okay.
So Cave Buttes, as disturbed as it is, and some of these smaller preserves on the north end just have them in abundance. Cave Buttes, where my horned lizard site is, where we're radio tracking the Phrynosoma solare, has one of the higher densities and doesn't have the other species. There are other large seed harvesters, but it doesn't have any of them that have large colonies. And so the horned lizards there are very specific in terms of their,
I want to take this quick opportunity to thank you for not only a great talk, but you caught me red-handed years and years ago claiming that platy rhinos was in my backyard in Phoenix, and I was totally wrong. And that should be stricken for the record forever.
No problem, Bob.
All right. There's a question here in the chat from Mr. Myers. He says, I noticed that the California king snake was not well represented in your data. Do you think that their numbers could be in decline?
So actually, let me, I'm going to go back to it. I realized I did just open this. That was supposed to be the closing slide, a sillier looking shot of a Chuckwalla in that setting. But let me now, since I've got it here, if anyone asks about the tortoises, I have those. I'm going to go back to the numbers. Whoops, sorry.
It's quite remarkable to see a Chuckwalla on a brick wall.
It is. So Lamprobeltis, I'm calling it Getula here. It's, would be Californiense now, if you're keeping up with taxonomy, is 1%. So it's a rare snake at Cave Buttes, but because of the riparian corridor, Lamprobeltis is a riparian snake, in my humble opinion, in most of the Sonoran Desert. And so Cave Creek is an intermittent riparian corridor, but all of those that we have found over the years, it's about a half dozen, have been in the Cave Creek floodplain, and it's still there. It hasn't declined. The metro area, a study has just appeared, authored by a colleague at ASU Poly, the east side of town, Heather Bateman, that some of you probably know, and the folks who work with Rattlesnake Solutions, I think I have that name right, Brian Hughes and others, they looked at their database, and out of the, say, I'm going to make this up, so don't quote me on it, but in a 2-year period, the 2,000 snakes, they translocated, right? Mitigation, translocation. They get a call, person has them take the snake out of their yard. Lamprobeltis was, I think, number 4 in abundance. So in certain contexts, certain environmental settings around golf courses and agricultural areas where they're more mesic, I think Lamprepeltis can actually do well. Now, there's always the trade-off, increased mortality due to roadway traffic and this, that, and the other. But even in my neighborhood, I live in, suburbia near Lookout Mountain, that one preserve that we saw a few times. And there are still Lamprepeltis in our neighborhood, again, near golf courses, near the preserve, and so on. So my guess is that they can hang on as long as it's not high density housing.
I'm wondering if you have any data on Mediterranean geckos. I mean, they're not they're introduced species, but are you looking at how they function in urban settings or their place?
No, I am not. And they certainly are widespread. And we also have the bent-toed gecko has been established, and we have the Moorish gecko. So there are now 3 species.
Wow.
I just was talking to Randy about these kestrels, and he has a screech owl nest under observation just off of our site in the North Phoenix area near Carefree. And he was telling me that the screech owls take Hemidactylus all the time. And so even out there in a low density housing area, I was a little surprised. I think that he was mentioning it to me because he was surprised too, that they're in that, area well north of the urban core that we might have thought the geckos are, entrenched in. But yeah, I think they're doing well. And as long as it's a house and vertical habitat and lights and the rest of it, they're probably spreading outwardly. But we don't ever see them under coverboards or in piles of garbage, things like that. They would have to be ground dwelling to be in the kinds of things that we would find them at our site.
Mm-hmm. And a second question related to Aspedoceles. There's always been a rumor in Tucson that the whiptails that ostensibly look like Sonoran whiptails have been conditioned to urban Tucson for so long that they might be a cryptic species by now. What's your impression of this maybe happening in the Phoenix area? Are there besides tiger whiptails, are there other whiptails in the?
No, we're a depauperate whiptail. We're a depauperate relative to Tucson in so many ways.
Huh.
And we've got too much of what we don't want, but we don't need to go on with just how bad Phoenix can be. But one of the things we do lack are additional whiptails. And now the tigris that are here are a robust and impressive species. And I just think that they're a more, sounds like we're ranking them on some, Olympic contest, but they somehow, as a ground dwelling lizard, fare better than Uta. And then they're not in every, environmental setting. In fact, speaking of that, this last slide, this is one that I didn't get to. This is by another student. There's a very elegant study, and that's again you've seen 5 different portrayals of an aerial view of Phoenix, and I don't explain them all to you, but in any case, take that as a bunch of pie slices on sites that this student did just an amazing study on the lizards present in the Phoenix area. And all you need to know is brown is Urosaurus. So any of these cylinders that are solely brown means the only lizard you find is Urosaurus. And then some urban areas have no lizards. And some of these that had Urosaurus didn't have Aspedoceles. There were no tigris there. It also shows that you have to get out of town to get Uta. That's the aqua color here. And you don't need to strain yourself trying to sort this out. But the point is, Urosaurus is the ubiquitous urban exploiter of the herp world. I mean, you could say it's a house gecko if you want. They're probably equivalent in terms of how much area they occupy now. But Aspedoceles, for example, in most of those student surveys that were in their neighborhoods, they would incidentally tell me, they got a tigress as well. But those would always be the only two native lizards that they would pick up. Another example on the gecko front, Coleonyx, when I first got to my house, which is 30 years ago, it's on the edge of this preserve, and it had been built 4 years before, and it's about 300 meters from the preserve. At that time, on the north edge of Phoenix, there were still Coleonyx in the yard. So we had banded geckos. We did not have house geckos. And the banded geckos disappear in about 5 to 10 years. And again, I'm convinced it's cats or whatever it is. And the house geckos appear in that time span.
I have two more things in the chat here. Maggie Fusari is also pointing to invasive ant species, maybe replacing the native Pogonomyrmex as a contributor to the decline in horned lizards as well.
And that is something that has been discovered in other parts of the country. California and Texas both have stories of that nature. I couldn't get anything along those lines out of our ant specialist, but I think it's worth considering.
Yeah,
that there might be. There certainly aren't any obvious introduced species in our area, but that might be the problem. That's why we're missing it. But I think it's an excellent question.
And Hannah Strauss, hello Hannah, says she's wondering where the Scoloporus magister are. She seems to notice a decline of them from her yard in Tucson, or in her area of Tucson.
Oh, I'm surprised to hear that for Tucson, because whenever I'm in Tucson, one of my sons and my two grandkids live in Tucson. And so I'm a fairly regular visitor, and I do little urban walks that I tally up the lizards. And I'm so impressed with your Scoloporus magister abundance. So I haven't seen it, but it's a very small portion of central Tucson that I go to. And that's not true in Phoenix. Now, my historic explanation for the differences between Phoenix and Tucson, besides all of the other things we alluded to, and political and otherwise, we can go on all night. One of them is you have to recognize that Phoenix was scraped clean by and large, the flats, and planted with cotton and citrus 100 years ago. And the vast majority of urbanization has been imposed on an agricultural desert environment. Whereas Phoenix, I'm impressed that when I'm walking around the Sam Hughes neighborhood or the Arizona Inn or any of those places, I can find a creosote bush and a seed harvester ant nest. Phil and I used to talk about the fact that he had little patches where Phrynosoma solare was holding on in the Tucson area because the ants are there.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't happen in Phoenix nearly as often. There are some examples, but in any case, Magister is primarily in Phoenix associated with areas that have arboreal habitat on steroids. And so what I mean by that is many high density housing areas just don't seem to have it. But if you're interspersed with horse properties, or and that's just a larger property with some open space and a few big trees is what I'm using there in the vernacular, you often find that they're holding their own. They are one of the big four of the four lizards up at Cave Buttes, which I didn't talk about these data, the whole community, but the four common lizards are Uta's number one, and then Aspidoscelis is number two, that's Tigris, and then Callosaurus, Draconoides, zebratail, and Scoloporus magister, the desert spiny, is number four. Those are the four really common lizards, so to speak, in their relative ranking up there. And so mountain preserves typically have some Scoloporus. They don't have a lot of them. And then the neighborhood, it just depends.
Yeah. This kind of ties it, you brought up Phil, and one of the last projects he had been working on before he passed away was sort of quantifying or looking at the relocation or translocation of urban lizards from developments, and sort of seeding. He was trying to seed lizards into other areas and to mitigate disturbance in the Tucson urban area. And the big things like Gila monsters and such, they are a little bit harder to relocate successfully. but it's interesting to note the smaller species, there's maybe a little bit more success, I'm guessing, at introducing them into, urban lots or other parts of Tucson, little corridors, wildlife corridors, like the washes and things like that.
I think you're absolutely right. Phil had the right idea with focusing on trying to get neonates, to get the offspring at the youngest age. And that I'm all for. And I'm all for, if you're going to mitigate, translocate, you should put them in places where they occurred historically, but are currently absent. This notion of you're just saving the individual, and I know, I'll rub people the wrong way. We have got to get off the notion that individuals matter.
Yeah.
Populations matter. Habitat matters most of all. Now, don't get me wrong. I feel as bad as anyone else when I see that this individual is going to die as a result of what we're doing, and I want to save it too. But I don't want to sentence it to a slow death in a new environment where it's among a bunch of conspecifics and we haven't really gotten anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So his idea was to get those youngsters from the adults, from a population that was experiencing, decline, meaning it was going to be lost to whatever the development was, or who knows, and you move them to an area where they should occur and they have the prey there. That's the best of those bad situations. Then and then I'd say even the adults, sure, you're going to lose 80% of them, but some of them might survive, or some of them might breed and lay some eggs. And so, I'm not completely anti-translocation. I just think we have to have the data for our species, and that saving the individuals shouldn't be the paramount concern.
Yeah, it's really frustrating relocating Gila monsters and rattlesnakes in these sort of increasingly checkered urban areas where it gets increasingly difficult to stay within a mile of the capture site.
Oh, absolutely. It's difficult.
A lot of weighing of the issues. James Collins asks about translocating Chuckwallas.
So Brian,
yeah.
Good talk, Brian.
Thanks.
So in your spirit of the point you were just making about conserving populations as opposed to focusing on individuals, what about moving juvenile Chuckwallas in the spirit of improving genetic diversity?
Absolutely. And that would be the way to do it, because the kids up and take off. That's what we know. Jimmy McGuire, who's worked on collared lizards, and Brad Hollingsworth, both in California, that worked on Chuckwallas. I'll never forget, they came to my study sites in the 90s, and I was so impressed. They convinced me that as much as we know Chuckwallas are this absolutely, rock dwelling specialist, that they would find them, for example, in the Sea of Cortez, floating, regularly. And they're a reptile, given their air, inflating lungs and body cavity approach, are made for it. And they used to argue about dispersal. They were convinced that Chuckwallas disperse more than other lizards like Crotalophytus, who's another rock-dwelling lizard. They thought that barriers between mountains were more important for collared lizards than for Chuckwallas. This just shocked me. But in any case, over the years, I started seeing Chuckwallas in, occasionally, very rarely, I'll even be honest and say, but in flats. And so I'm convinced that the gene flow issue will be one, but it's the kids that are doing it. It's the 3 to 5 year stage before they reach adulthood that our data suggest are the dispersing, individuals. And so you can often find them because they have relatively high mortality. So you can find them in large numbers. You wouldn't have to be starting a breeding colony kind of thing. You could just be collecting in the fall as many of those from a particular area, swapping them and so on. And I think the mountain preserves, especially given, they're already compromised. For example, not just swapping Chuckwallas, I think the few that have caliche formations, we could be releasing some of these tortoises that are simply going to be pets in backyards because they are never going to populate any natural environment. You could do experiments with tortoises in these mountain preserves to reintroduce them and so on. knowing that it's basically a big experiment because it's self-contained and they're not going anywhere with their respiratory ailments and the rest of it, if you know the desert tortoise study. So yeah, I'm a big fan of doing all sorts of translocation under carefully controlled and well thought out conditions.
Yeah, thanks.
Great question. Hannah Strauss is wondering about the effects of urban cats. What, you know, we can do all these translocation ideas and so forth, but what's your impression about the impact of urban cats?
Of course, like everybody else, I just imagine that they're bad. And I say that I grew up with cats, and, you know, it's not that I'm a cat hater, but we have some data from some situations. Some of it suggests they're not as bad as we all think they are, but, you know, virtually every conservation biologist, especially the birders, just think they're horrific. And I tend to think they're right in many settings, but we don't know that as well for lizards. Lots of anecdotes. And again, I won't back off. I'm just playing for time here in my response because we don't have any data, but we're all convinced that they're bad. And it just sort of fits the anecdotes of the ground dwelling lizards are the ones that go, but we would need some more. California, I think, again, Brad Hollingsworth and Brad Schaefer, I was speaking to at a conservation get together some years back, and they were convinced that the more secretive lizards that we don't have so much here in the metro areas, but in California, skinks and alligator lizards, right, are able to survive cat activities better than the little phrynosomatids that are always basking, sitting out exposed and so on. And again, it was anecdotal, but that makes sense to me too, understanding the natural history, that the more secretive forms that kept under cover would be less likely to be taken by the cats. But yeah, no hard data, sorry.
Just two more things that are sort of related. Have you looked at sort of the conditions of coverboards, like the microclimates under artificial or debris, man-made debris, and what, you know, the fluctuations of wet winters and dry winters, like with Sonora, for example, what they're going after, what they like, the benefits, I guess, of coverboards and such.
So no, I have not looked at it in any detail. We need some, you know, physiological ecologists out there to really get after some of these questions. But my guess is, and Randy and I have talked about this, that, you know, they're an invertebrate eating snake. They're primarily feeding on larvae of various organisms, coleopterans and lepidopterans and such, that you find in abundance in wet years under these boards. And I think that's what's keying them to that position. And then they're going down the snakes into the crevices when it's dry. They strike me very much as a California situation I grew up with. Diodophis and Contius, or the ringneck snake, and the sharp-tailed snake, if you happen to know those out west. And in California, Diodophis is a snake that is very attuned to moisture conditions. Every March, as you came out of the winter, I had a series of railroad ties in the, you know, the big field next to my house where I grew up, that I could count on finding 5 to 10 of them over about a 4-week period. And that was it. The rest of the year, never saw them. It was too dry. They were, you know, and then of course the Mediterranean summer and the rest of it. I'm convinced that these Sonora are much more like Diodophis. They're tied into this not only for their prey, but I think for their physiological ecology. And again, it would take, you know, another whole thing to get at, you know, what's different about them. You think of them as a desert snake. Well, they actually are another one that is somewhat of an urban exploiter. They're the only snake that I find commonly in the yards that I have sampled. They've been in my yard for 30 years. And we're talking about, you know, Moon Valley, neighbors that are spraying pesticides like there's no tomorrow, and, you know, this, that, and the other. And of course, I don't do anything, but, you know, this isn't just a population due to my house. I'm convinced of that. So in any case, I think the mesic conditions that we provide and that are available in the desert intermittently are perhaps the key to their ecology.
Yeah. One last question, and maybe Roger Rep can chime in if he's still with us. But what's your perception of any shifts in winter activity in the last several years? Yeah.
Yeah. So of course, yeah, great question for climate change, and my guess is that the degree shifts, which are a couple of degrees in the last 25 years. We know that for the urban heat island studies, that has been well documented. But at the level of what we're talking about, like say under cover boards and in general, my guess is it's probably still too small. But those are famous last words, I'm sure. And a physiological ecologist would take me to task for that. What I can say is I've always been impressed with how the smaller species like Uta have always been active year round. And I'm thinking that Sonora has always been active year round. So, 30 years ago, I'll never forget, new seeing Uta in January. The males are fully primed and ready to go. They've got colors, their hemipenes are swollen. The females are going to be laying in a month. And so, you can't get any more than year round. But some of the other species, I'll give you a reverse example. The Phrynosoma, I'm just getting the 6th year data set now. We have 36 animals that have overwintered. So we have 36 data points. It's really tough work to get it on these lizards that we put a tag on, because we have to get them when they go in the fall and get them when they come out. So their tag has to last the entire time so we don't lose track of them. So we've got 36 data points for an entire brumation, as we would call it, right? Hibernation, overwintering. Those Phrynosoma solare begin going in the end of September. They're all down by October 31st. Males go in first, females go in second. And they're just right at the surface next to a creosote shrub, just barely under debris. And they don't emerge until now.
Wow.
So the average duration of brumation is 187 days, more than 6 months of the year. Temperature has nothing to do with it.
Wow.
And that's what we always thought. Physiological ecologists, that's what runs brumation, hibernation, overwintering. You're an ectotherm. It's the ants. The ants are primarily active in the summer, a little bit before, a little bit after, and you can't get 200 a day unless you're up in late May, June, July, August, and September. Otherwise, you might as well be brumating. And so, there's one for you. I don't think the temperature is going to affect them at all. Those horned lizards love to be hot, as you can imagine. And as long as it doesn't kill the ants, I think they're just fine with it. But in any case, I'm going on and on here.
No, this is a great talk. And maybe next time you can talk about urban amphibians.
Yeah, there you go. They're still there as long as it rains. These 3 years are a tough span, and I worry that those spans will be increasingly, in evidence, but they'd be fine if it rains good this summer. They'll be right back out there.
Yeah. Well, doesn't look like there are any more questions in the chat function, but anybody wants to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, I would like. I was raised in Central Phoenix, as you know, Brian, and everything you said tonight fits my experiences there. Urosaurus reigned supreme. Sonora semiannulata reigned supreme. Surprisingly, Thamnophis marcianus was in great numbers eating Bufo woodhousey. I noticed in your table you have one Certopsis, and that's the only garter snake.
Yes, yeah, that is interesting, and I'll bet that was, and we won't make any age references here, Bob, but that you were closer to the agricultural heyday, and of the valley, so to speak, at that time, and I'll bet that helps explain Marcianus being around the way that they are in the southeast and Southwest Valley areas that are still dominated by agriculture. That's a good observation.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks again very much. I appreciate having you talk, and we will be back soon. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Appreciated it.